The train station in Cedar Falls, Iowa, smelled of diesel fuel and wet concrete on that September morning in 1945. Rain had fallen through the night, leaving puddles that reflected the gray sky like scattered mirrors across the platform. Captain Margaret Holloway stood beneath the overhang, clipboard pressed against her uniform jacket, watching as a group of 23 women descended from the military transport train. They moved slowly, deliberately, their worn boots scraping against the metal steps. Some carried small bundles wrapped in brown paper. Others had nothing at all. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you're enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. These were German prisoners of war, women who had served in support roles for the Wehrmacht, radio operators, clerks, medical assistants, mechanics. They had been captured in France during the final push toward Berlin, processed through holding facilities in England, then shipped across the Atlantic to various internment camps scattered throughout the American Midwest. For 18 months, they had worked in laundries, kitchens, and agricultural facilities, their labor contributing to the war effort of the nation that had defeated their homeland. Now the war was over. Europe lay in ruins, and these women were being told they could go home. Margaret watched as Private Ruth Coleman, her assistant, began checking names against the roster. The women lined up without being told, their posture still military despite the exhaustion evident in their faces. Margaret had processed dozens of repatriation groups over the past 3 months. Italian POWs, a handful of Japanese Americans being released from internment, even a few German men who had renounced the Nazi regime. But something about this group unsettled her. Perhaps it was the way they looked at the train behind them, not with relief or anticipation, but with something closer to dread. "Captain Holloway," Ruth's voice pulled her from her thoughts. "They're all accounted for. 23 women from Camp Algona. The transport to New York leaves in 4 hours. They'll board the SS Marine Falcon on Tuesday." Margaret nodded, stepping forward. She had given this speech so many times that the words came automatically now, though she tried to infuse them with sincerity each time. "Ladies, my name is Captain Margaret Holloway. On behalf of the United States Army, I want to inform you that your repatriation has been approved. You will be transported to New York, where you will board a vessel bound for Bremerhaven. From there, you will be processed by Allied authorities and released to return to your homes. The war is over. You are free to go." She expected relief, perhaps tears of joy. Instead, she was met with silence so profound it seemed to absorb the sound of the rain drumming on the overhang above. One woman, tall with blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun, stepped forward. Her face was angular, marked by a scar that ran from her left temple to her jaw. When she spoke, her English was accented but precise. "Captain, with respect, we request permission to remain in the United States." Margaret blinked. In all her months of processing repatriations, no one had ever refused to go home. "I'm sorry, could you repeat that?" The blonde woman's jaw tightened. "My name is Liesl Weber. I was a radio operator with the 14th Signal Battalion. These women and we do not wish to return to Germany. We formally request asylum or permission to remain as displaced persons." Ruth dropped her clipboard. It clattered against the concrete, but no one moved to kick it up. Margaret felt the weight of 23 pairs of eyes fixed on her, waiting. Behind the women, the train engine hissed, releasing a plume of steam that drifted across the platform, like a ghost. "Miss Weber, I don't think you understand," Margaret said carefully. "The war is over. Germany is being rebuilt. The Allied forces are providing food, shelter, medical care. Your families are likely searching for you. Why would you want to stay here?" Liesl's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes, something hard and ancient. "Because, Captain, there is nothing left to go home to, and even if there were, we are not welcome there." Another woman stepped forward, shorter and rounder, with dark hair threaded with premature gray. She couldn't have been more than 30, but she carried herself like someone much older. "My name is Anneliese Brunt. I was a field nurse. I have 3 sisters in Stuttgart, or I did before the bombing. I received word 6 months ago that our family home was destroyed. My mother and youngest sister died in the rubble. My other sisters—" She paused, swallowing hard. "They wrote to tell me not to come back. They said the neighbors blame our family for the war because my brother served in the SS. They said if I return, they cannot guarantee my safety." Margaret felt the ground shift beneath her feet, though she knew it was only her perspective changing. She had processed repatriations as administrative tasks, checkbox items on a form. She had never considered that home might be a place you couldn't return to even when the doors were open. "Captain," Liesl continued, her voice steady but underlining urgency, "we have worked in your laundries, your hospitals, your farms. We have learned English. We have caused no trouble. Some of us have nothing left in Germany, no family, no homes, no prospects. Others have families who have disowned them for surrendering rather than fighting to the death. We are asking for a chance to stay, to work, to rebuild our lives here, rather than returning to a country that sees us as traitors or reminders of shame." Ruth had retrieved her clipboard and was scribbling furiously, though Margaret wasn't sure what she was writing. A crowd had begun to gather, other soldiers waiting for trains, a few civilians, a porter pushing a cart loaded with luggage. They stared at the women with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Margaret could feel the moment crystallizing into something larger than a simple administrative procedure. "Ladies," she said, choosing her words carefully, "what you're asking for is not within my authority to grant. Repatriation is policy. It's been decided at levels far above my rank. I don't have the power to—" "Then who does?" Liesl interrupted. "Who do we speak to? Who makes these decisions? Because we will speak to them, Captain. We will make our case. We have that right, don't we? Even as prisoners." Margaret looked at Ruth, who shrugged helplessly. The legal status of POWs after the war's end was murky at best. They were no longer enemy combatants, but they weren't citizens or even refugees in the traditional sense. The Geneva Convention covered treatment during captivity, but repatriation procedures were evolving day by day as different nations negotiated the return of millions of displaced people. "Let me make some calls," Margaret finally said, "but I need you to understand that the likely answer will be no. The United States government wants these matters resolved quickly and cleanly. Allowing POWs to remain creates complications." "Complications," Annalise repeated, the word bitter on her tongue. "Yes, we understand complications, Captain. We have been living complications for 6 years." Margaret directed the women to a holding area, a converted warehouse near the station that still smelled of the grain it had once stored. Military cots had been set up in rows, and there were basic facilities, bathrooms, a small kitchen area, and tables and chairs. It was better than the camps they had come from, but worse than freedom. Ruth arranged for food to be brought, while Margaret retreated to a small office in the station master's building, a cramped room with a telephone that connected her to a web of military bureaucracy. She spent 3 hours on the phone, transferred from one office to another, explaining the situation over and over. Most officials dismissed the request immediately. "Send them back," Colonel Patterson at the War Department said flatly. "We have enough problems without coddling enemy prisoners who suddenly develop cold feet about going home." Major Reeves at Immigration was more sympathetic, but equally powerless. "Even if we wanted to help them, Holloway, the political climate makes it impossible. Can you imagine the headlines? U.S. harbors Nazi women while American boys come home in coffins?" But one call yielded a different response. Lieutenant Colonel James Brennan, stationed at the Pentagon but working as a liaison with the newly formed United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, listened without interrupting. When Margaret finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "How many women?" he finally asked. 23, sir. "And you believe their concerns about returning are legitimate?" Margaret thought about Liesl's scarred face, Annalise's haunted eyes. "Yes, sir, I do." "The directive from Washington is clear, Captain. All POWs are to be repatriated unless they pose a security risk or unless their return would violate their human rights under international law. Now, that second clause was added specifically for cases involving forced repatriation to Soviet-controlled territories where we know POWs might face execution. But theoretically, it could apply to other situations. What would I need to prove, sir? That returning them would put them in immediate physical danger, not hardship, not difficulty, but genuine threat to life or safety. And even then, it would require approval from the Secretary of War's office, maybe higher. Margaret felt a headache building behind her eyes. How long would that take? Weeks, possibly months. And, Captain, I'll be honest with you, the likelihood of approval is slim. The political will to help German nationals, even women, even POWs, simply doesn't exist right now. The country wants to close this chapter, not extend it. After she hung up, Margaret sat in the chair and stared at the wall. Rain continued to fall outside, heavier now, drumming against the window like fingers seeking entrance. She thought about her own brother, Timothy, who had died at Normandy. She thought about the newsreels she had seen of concentration camps, of skeletal survivors, of mass graves. She thought about how easy it was to hate an entire nation, an entire people, when their government had committed such atrocities. But then she thought about Liesl Weber standing on that platform asking not for forgiveness or pity, but simply for a chance. She thought about Anneliese Brandt, whose sisters had told her not to come home. Ruth appeared in the doorway holding 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to Margaret without speaking and sat down in the only other chair, an old wooden thing that creaked under her weight. "What are you going to tell them?" Ruth asked. "The truth, that the answer is almost certainly no, but that we can try." "And if they refuse to get on that train to New York?" Margaret sipped her coffee. It was terrible, bitter and lukewarm, but she drank it anyway. The warehouse was quiet when Margaret and Ruth returned, save for the murmur of German conversation and the clink of spoons against metal trays. The women had been fed, canned stew, bread, weak coffee, and now they sat in small clusters on the cots, speaking in low voices. They fell silent when Margaret entered, 23 faces turning toward her with expressions that ranged from hopeful to resigned. Liesl Weber stood immediately, as if she had been waiting at attention. "Captain, what did you learn?" Margaret set her clipboard on one of the tables and gestured for the women to gather. They came slowly, some with visible limps, others moving with the careful deliberation of people who had learned not to draw attention to themselves. They formed a loose semicircle, and Margaret noticed details she had missed on the platform. The way several women had bandaged hands, the hollow cheeks that spoke of inadequate nutrition, the watchfulness in their eyes that came from months or years of being treated as enemy. "I spoke with several officials in Washington," Margaret began. "The policy is clear. All prisoners of war are to be repatriated unless their return would pose a genuine threat to their safety. What you're asking for, to remain in the United States as displaced persons or refugees, is not something that falls within standard procedures." She watched their faces fall and hurried to continue. "However, there may be a path forward. If we can document specific threats to your safety in Germany, if we can prove that returning you would violate international human rights law, there's a slim possibility that exceptions could be made. But I need to be honest with you. The process will be long, complicated, and the likelihood of success is very small." "How small?" Liesl asked. "Honestly, maybe 5%, maybe less." A woman in the back began to cry quietly. Another put an arm around her shoulders. Anneliese Brandt stepped forward, her expression fierce. 5% is better than 0, Captain. What do we need to do?" Over the next hour, Margaret interviewed each woman individually, taking notes on their personal situations, their reasons for not wanting to return, their family situations. Ruth assisted, translating when necessary, though most of the women's English was functional if not fluent. Liesl Weber had been a radio operator for 3 years before her capture. She came from Munich, where her father had been a professor of literature at the university. Her scar, she explained, matter-of-factly, came from shrapnel when her unit's communications post was bombed. Her father had died in 1943, a heart attack, the official letter said, though Liesl suspected it was the stress of living under constant suspicion because he criticized the regime's book burnings in the early years. Her mother and younger brother had died in the firebombing of Dresden. She had no one left. "But that's not why I won't go back," Liesl said, her fingers laced together on the table. "I could survive being alone. What I cannot survive is being marked as a traitor. When I was captured, I surrendered. I put my hands up and I walked toward the American lines. My commanding officer, Lieutenant Vogel, he shot at me. He missed, but only because another explosion knocked him down. If I return, and if any of my former comrades learned what I did, they would see it as cowardice. Germany right now is divided, Captain. Some want to forget the war ever happened, others are nursing their resentment, planning for another time. I will not be safe in either camp." Anneliese Braun's story was different but equally bleak. She had worked as a field nurse near the French border, treating wounded soldiers on both sides when supplies allowed. She had written to her sisters every month during her captivity, and their responses had grown colder and more distant over time. The final letter, which she showed Margaret with trembling hands, was brief and devastating. "Do not come back. Mother is dead. Greta is dead. The neighbors blame us for everything. They say father was a war criminal because he managed a factory that used slave labor, even though he had no choice. They threw stones at our house. Helga was beaten in the market. We are moving to Hamburg to live with cousins. You will not be welcome. I am sorry, but this is how things are. Please understand. Maria." "My sister Maria, she was always the practical one," Anneliese said, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "If she says I cannot come home, I believe her. She would not lie to protect my feelings." A young woman named Katharina Schultz, barely 20, had been a mechanic for a transport division. She had no family left in Germany, all killed during the Soviet advance into East Prussia. But she had fallen in love with an American soldier during her time at Camp Algona, a guard named Robert Chen, whose family had emigrated from China 2 generations earlier. They had spoken through the fence during her work details, brief conversations that grew longer over months. He had been transferred to a base in California 3 months ago, but they had exchanged addresses. She had a letter from him in her pocket, worn soft from repeated reading. "I don't know if he feels the same way I do," Katharina admitted, her face flushing. "But he asked me to write to him. He said after the war, maybe we could... I don't know. I know it's foolish. I know I'm dreaming. But, Captain, what do I have in Germany? Nothing. No one. At least here there's a possibility of something." Each story was unique, yet they shared common threads: loss, displacement, fear of retribution, the simple human desire for a fresh start in a place that hadn't been destroyed by the war. Margaret filled page after page in her notebook, Ruth's pencil scratching beside her, both women working in a focused silence broken only by the women's voices and occasional tears. By evening, Margaret had compiled what she hoped was a compelling case. 15 of the women had no remaining family in Germany. 8 had families who had explicitly told them not to return due to local hostility. 3 had communist sympathizers in their families and feared persecution as the country divided between East and West. 2 were Jewish women who had hidden their heritage to survive and now feared exposure in post-war Germany's uncertain climate. Every one of them had expressed genuine fear about their safety, their prospects, their ability to rebuild lives in a country that lay in ruins both physically and morally. But Margaret knew that facts and documentation weren't always enough. The world ran on rules and policies, but it also ran on stories, on human connection, on the ability to make people in power see the faces behind the forms. She needed help. That night, Margaret returned to her small apartment in town, a second-floor walk-up above a drugstore. She made dinner, canned soup and crackers, and sat at her kitchen table with a pad of paper and a pen. She began writing letters, one to her contact at the Pentagon, Lieutenant Colonel Brennan, pleading for his assistance in navigating the bureaucracy, one to a journalist she had met at a war bond rally 2 years earlier, a woman named Dorothy Marks, who wrote for the Chicago Tribune and had a reputation for stories about the human cost of war, one to her local congressman, though she had little hope he would care about the fate of German POWs. She wrote until her hand cramped, then kept writing. The rain had stopped, but the streets outside remained wet, reflecting the streetlights in shimmering pools. Somewhere a dog barked. A car passed, its tires hissing on the damp pavement. The ordinary sounds of a country at peace, though Margaret wondered how long that peace would last and what form it would take. In the warehouse, the women settled into an uncertain routine. Days passed with agonizing slowness. Margaret visited daily, bringing updates that were really just variations on "no news yet." She brought newspapers so they could read about the world they were no longer part of, stories about the Nuremberg trials, about displaced persons camps in Europe, about soldiers returning home to parades and celebrations. The women read these stories in silence, their expressions unreadable. Ruth, who had initially been skeptical about the women's request, found herself becoming invested in their fates. She brought books from the library, taught English lessons in the evenings, helped the women write letters to what remained of their families. She learned their stories in deeper detail, the small memories they carried, the dreams they had set aside, the guilt they felt for surviving when so many hadn't. One afternoon, Ruth sat with a woman named Margaret Hoffman, who had been a clerk in a supply depot. Marguerite was knitting, something Ruth's grandmother had taught her, she said. A scarf in gray wool that she worked on constantly, her needles clicking in a soothing rhythm. "My daughter loved scarves," Marguerite said, suddenly, her eyes on her work. "I made her a red one when she was 8. She wore it every day that winter until it was so dirty my husband insisted I wash it. She cried the whole time it was hanging on the line, afraid it wouldn't dry before bedtime." She paused, her hands stilling. "She was 12 when the bombs came. She was wearing that scarf when we buried her. I had mended it so many times by then that it was more patches than original wool, but she still loved it." Ruth didn't know what to say, so she simply sat with Marguerite in the silence, watching the gray scarf grow longer, row by row. Margaret, meanwhile, was fighting a different kind of battle. The response from Lieutenant Colonel Brennan was cautiously encouraging. He would forward her documentation up the chain of command, but he warned her again not to expect miracles. The congressman's office sent a form letter thanking her for her correspondence and assuring her that her concerns were noted. The journalist, Dorothy Marks, was the most promising. She called Margaret 3 days after receiving the letter. "Captain Holloway, this is Dorothy Marks. I got your letter about the German POWs. Tell me everything." Margaret did, speaking for nearly an hour while Dorothy asked sharp, probing questions. When Margaret finished, Dorothy was quiet for a moment. "This is a hell of a story," she finally said. "Human interest gold, but it's also political dynamite. I can write it, but I need you to understand something, Captain. Once this story goes public, it's going to create pressure on you, on those women, on everyone involved. Some of that pressure will be supportive, a lot of it won't be. Are you prepared for that?" Margaret thought about Liesl's scar, about Annalise's sisters, about Katerina's worn letter. "Yes," she said, "I am." "Then give me a week. I'll come to Cedar Falls and interview some of the women myself. If their stories are as compelling in person as they are in your summary, I'll run it on the front page of the Sunday edition." When Margaret told the women about Dorothy's planned visit, their reactions were mixed. Some were eager, hoping publicity might help their case. Others were terrified, worried that being identified in a newspaper would make them targets.
"What if people in Germany read it?" asked a woman named Frida Klein, who had worked in a laundry at the camp. "What if they find out where we are and what we said?" "That's a valid concern," Margaret acknowledged. "Dorothy has agreed to use pseudonyms if you prefer, and she won't include identifying details that could be traced back to specific individuals. But I won't lie to you, there's risk involved. There's risk in everything we're trying to do." Liesl, who would become the unofficial leader of the group, stood up. "We vote," she said simply. "Those who want to participate in the interview can. Those who don't, won't. But we do this together or not at all." The vote was unanimous. All 23 women agreed to meet with Dorothy Marks. The journalist arrived on a bright October morning, carrying a leather satchel and a camera. She was younger than Margaret expected, maybe 35, with sharp eyes and an efficient manner that reminded Margaret of certain nurses she had worked with, people who had seen too much to be easily shocked but hadn't yet lost their capacity for empathy. Dorothy spent 3 days in Cedar Falls, interviewing each woman individually and then as a group. She took notes in shorthand, asked follow-up questions, pressed gently on contradictions or unclear points. She was professional but warm, and Margaret watched the women relax in her presence, sharing details they hadn't even told Margaret. On her second day, Dorothy asked if she could photograph the women. "Just a group shot," she said, "nothing identifying. I'm thinking maybe silhouettes against a window, something artistic that protects your identities but shows your humanity." They arranged themselves in the warehouse's main room near the large windows that faced west. The afternoon sun backlit them, turning them into dark figures against the light. Dorothy took several shots, the camera shuddering clicking in the quiet space. Looking at the scene, Margaret thought it looked like something from a painting. Anonymous women suspended between one world and another, caught in a moment of waiting. On her last evening in town, Dorothy had dinner with Margaret at a small diner near the train station. They sat in a booth by the window, eating meatloaf and mashed potatoes, while Dorothy flipped through her notes. "These women have gotten under your skin," Dorothy observed. It wasn't a question. Margaret nodded. "I never thought I'd feel this way about enemy POWs. When I started this job, they were just names on forms, problems to be processed. But getting to know them, hearing their stories, they're not the enemy anymore. They're just people who got caught in something much bigger than themselves." "Most people are," Dorothy said. "The problem is that our governments and our policies don't always account for that." She closed her notebook and leaned back. "I'm going to write this story, Captain, and I think it's going to cause some trouble, but I also think it's important. These women represent something we don't want to acknowledge, that war doesn't end when the fighting stops, and that the categories we use to organize the world, friend and enemy, good and bad, they're not as clear as we'd like them to be." "Will this story help them?" Margaret asked. "Honestly, I don't know. It might. It might also make things harder. But at least people will know. At least there will be a record of what happened here, of what these women tried to do. That counts for something." The article ran 2 weeks later on the front page of the Chicago Tribune's Sunday edition. The headline read, "German POWs refuse repatriation. We have nothing to return to." The photograph showed the women's silhouettes against the warehouse window, anonymous but undeniably human. The story was balanced but sympathetic, presenting the women's circumstances without glossing over the complexity of the situation. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The letters piled up, and with them came phone calls to Margaret's office, to the base commander, to Washington. Within a week, the story had been picked up by other newspapers. Some coverage was sympathetic, but most was critical.
Radio commentators debated the issue on evening broadcasts. A senator from Indiana gave a speech on the floor of Congress, condemning what he called misplaced sympathy for enemy combatants while American heroes struggle to rebuild their lives. The pressure intensified when a veterans organization in Chicago organized a protest. 50 men, many wearing their military uniforms, gathered outside the Tribune's offices carrying signs, "No Sanctuary for Nazis," and "Remember Pearl Harbor," and "American Lives Matter More." The protest was peaceful, but the message was clear. Public opinion was not on the women's side. Margaret felt the walls closing in. Her commanding officer, Colonel William Foster, called her into his office on a gray November morning. He was a career military man in his 50s, with iron gray hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. He gestured to a chair without preamble. "Captain Holloway, I've received 15 phone calls today. 15. From congressmen, senators, military brass, even a deputy assistant to the Secretary of War. They all want to know the same thing. Why in God's name are we still housing 23 German POWs in Cedar Falls when they were supposed to be on a ship to Germany 3 weeks ago?" "Sir, I'm trying to document their cases for—" "I know what you're trying to do," Foster interrupted, his voice sharp. "I've read the Tribune article, I've read your reports, and I understand your concerns. But Captain, you need to understand something. The optics of this situation are terrible. We have American soldiers coming home to find there aren't enough jobs, aren't enough houses, aren't enough resources. And here we are using military resources to house and feed German nationals who refuse to leave. How do you think that plays?" "Sir, these women have legitimate fears about returning to Germany. If we force them back, we might be sending them to their deaths." Foster's expression softened slightly, but his voice remained firm. "That's not for us to decide, Captain. That's above our pay grade. Our job is to follow orders and implement policy. And the policy is clear. Repatriate all POWs unless there's a compelling security reason not to. Hurt feelings and difficult circumstances don't qualify." "With respect, sir, I believe they do qualify. The Geneva Convention covers treatment during captivity. It doesn't give enemy aliens the right to choose which country they want to live in after the war." Languishine and Holloway are good listeners. Foster leaned forward, his hands flat on his desk. "Captain, I like you. You're a good officer, and your heart is in the right place. But this situation is becoming a political problem. And political problems have a way of destroying careers. I'm giving you 1 week to get this resolved. Document whatever you need to document, make whatever case you want to make, but at the end of that week, those women get on a transport to New York. Are we clear?" "Yes, sir." Margaret left Foster's office feeling like she had been punched in the stomach. 1 week. 7 days to overturn decades of policy and military procedure, to convince people who had already made their minds that these 23 women deserved something different than what everyone else was getting. She returned to the warehouse to find it in chaos. Someone, she never learned who, had discovered the location and publicized it. A crowd had gathered outside, maybe 24 people, some holding signs similar to those from the Chicago protest. They weren't violent, but their presence was intimidating. They chanted slogans, took photographs, and blocked the main entrance. Ruth met Margaret at the side door, her face pale. "It started about an hour ago. The women are terrified. Some of them think they're going to be attacked."
Inside, the women had gathered in the center of the warehouse, as far from the windows as possible. Some were crying. Others sat in silence, their faces blank with shock. Liesl stood at the edge of the group, her scarred face set in an expression of grim determination. "Captain," she said when Marguerite entered, "we understand if you need to stop helping us. This has become too big, too complicated. We never meant to cause such trouble." Marguerite looked at the faces surrounding her. Annalise with her prematurely gray hair, Katerina clutching her letter from Robert Chen, Marguerite with her ever-present knitting, Frida and all the others whose names and stories she now knew by heart. She thought about her brother Timothy, who had died fighting the regime these women had served. She thought about the 6 million Jews murdered in the Holocaust. She thought about the complexity of guilt and innocence, of individual choice and systemic evil, of how easy it was to hate and how hard it was to see past that hate to the human beings caught in history's machinery. "No," Margaret said firmly, "I'm not stopping. But I need to be honest with you. We have 1 week. After that, I'm under orders to put you on a transport ship. So if there's anything we can do, any angle we haven't explored, we need to do it now."
Captain Holloway, you have exceeded your authority and created a political firestorm that now reaches the highest levels of government. I have been instructed to inform you that your assignment is under review, and depending on the outcome of this situation, you may face disciplinary action up to and including court-martial. Margaret felt her stomach drop, but kept her voice steady. "Sir, I believe what I'm doing is right. These women—" "Your beliefs are irrelevant, Captain." Foster's face had turned red. "You are an officer in the United States Army. You follow orders, you implement policy. You do not make independent decisions that contradict direct commands from your superiors. Do you understand that?" "I understand, sir. But with respect, I believe there are times when following orders is not enough. When human lives are at stake, we have a moral obligation to dismiss, Captain. And consider yourself officially relieved of any further responsibilities regarding the German POWs. Major Hammond will take over the repatriation process, effective immediately." Margaret stood, saluted sharply, and left the office. In the hallway, she leaned against the wall for a moment, feeling the weight of what had just happened. Her career, which she had built over 6 years of service, was on the verge of collapse. But when she thought about Liesl's scarred face, about Annaliese's sisters throwing stones, about Katerina's desperate hope for a life with someone who saw her as human rather than enemy, Margaret knew she couldn't regret her choices. Ruth found her an hour later, sitting alone in the empty office that was no longer hers. The younger woman's eyes were red-rimmed, and she carried a manila envelope stuffed with papers. "I heard what happened. I'm so sorry, Captain." Margaret managed a weak smile. "I knew the risks. I just hoped—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "The women know too. Liesl asked me to give you this." Ruth handed over the envelope. Inside were 23 handwritten letters, each one addressed to Margaret. The handwriting varied, some elegant and practiced, others shaky and uncertain, but the sentiment was universal. Gratitude, apology, recognition that Margaret had sacrificed her career for strangers she owed nothing to. Liesl's letter was the longest. In it, she wrote about a professor she had known at university, a man who had hidden Jewish students in his home until he was discovered and executed by the Gestapo. He told his family before he died that some choices transcend law and policy, Liesl wrote, that there are moments when we must decide what kind of person we want to be, regardless of consequence. You made that choice for us, Captain Holloway. We will never forget it, no matter what happens next. The legal filing bought them 3 days. David Steinberg managed to get an emergency hearing before a federal judge in Des Moines, a man named Harold Webster, who had a reputation for careful consideration of complex cases. The hearing was scheduled for the following Monday, and Margaret was permitted to attend as a witness, though she was no longer the officer in charge. Major Hammond, her replacement, was a by-the-book officer who saw the women purely as an administrative problem to be solved. He scheduled their transport to New York for Tuesday morning, immediately after the hearing, regardless of its outcome. "If the judge rules in their favor, we'll cancel the transport," he told Margaret coldly. "But I'm not optimistic, and neither should you be." The weekend before the hearing was surreal. Margaret visited the warehouse on Saturday afternoon, finding the women in a state of quiet desperation. They had packed their few belongings, preparing for the likelihood that they would be forced onto that transport. Some prayed. Others wrote final letters to family members they might never see again. Katerina sat alone by a window, Robert Chen's letter pressed against her chest like a talisman. "I wrote to him. I told him what happened, that I tried to stay but couldn't.
I don't know if he'll ever get the letter. I don't even know if he cares, but I had to try to explain." Annalise had stopped eating. Ruth tried to coax her into taking some soup, but she refused. "What's the point?" Annalise asked, her voice hollow. "In 3 days I'll be on a ship. In 2 weeks I'll be in Germany. In a month I'll probably be dead, killed by people who blame me for things I had no power to prevent. Why prolong it?" Margaret knelt beside her cot. "Entschuldigung, sich Massings, immakervens chance," she said, though she wasn't sure she believed it herself. "Because giving up now means they win. Everyone who says you don't matter, that your life has no value. You matter, Annalise. Your life matters. Don't let them take that away from you." Sunday evening, the night before the hearing, Margaret couldn't sleep. She lay in her apartment staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the town settling into darkness. A church bell chimed midnight, then 1, then 2. She thought about all the decisions that had led her to this moment: joining the army, volunteering for prisoner processing duty, reading that first letter from Annalise's sisters. She thought about how one choice led to another, creating chains of consequence that couldn't be undone. At 3 in the morning, she gave up on sleep and made coffee. She sat at her kitchen table and reread the letters from the women, 23 different voices telling 23 different versions of the same story. We are lost, we are frightened, we are hoping against hope that someone will see us as human beings worthy of a second chance.
Monday morning arrived with steel-gray skies and a bitter wind that promised winter. Margaret dressed in her uniform for what might be the last time, making sure every button was polished, every crease sharp. If she was going down, she would go down looking like the officer she had tried to be. The courthouse in Des Moines was an imposing building of limestone and marble, its steps worn smooth by decades of people seeking justice. Inside, the courtroom was surprisingly small, with wooden benches and tall windows that let in the pale morning light. Judge Webster sat behind the bench, a man in his 60s with white hair and the patient expression of someone who had heard every argument the law could produce. David Steinberg presented the case with passionate precision. He outlined the women's circumstances, the threats they faced if returned to Germany, the precedent of international human rights law that should protect them. He called Margaret as a witness, and she testified about her interviews with the women, the documentation she had gathered, the letters from family members warning them not to return. The government's attorney, a sharp-faced woman named Patricia Morrison, countered with equal force. She argued that policy existed for a reason, that making exceptions would open floodgates, that these women had served the enemy and now sought special treatment unavailable to millions of other displaced persons struggling across Europe. "Your Honor," Morrison said, her voice cutting through the courtroom, "if we grant these women asylum based on general hardship and social difficulty, we establish a precedent that any POW with a sad story can refuse repatriation. The war created suffering on an unimaginable scale. We cannot solve it all by opening our borders to everyone who claims persecution. At some point, people must return to their countries and rebuild, however difficult that may be." The women sat in the gallery, silent witnesses to arguments about their lives delivered in language they only partially understood. Liesl's jaw was set, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. Annalise stared at the floor. Katerina had tears streaming down her face. Judge Webster listened without interruption, occasionally making notes. When both sides had finished, he was quiet for a long moment, studying the papers before him. "This is a difficult case," he finally said, his voice measured. "On one hand, we have policy and procedure designed to bring order to chaos, to resolve the aftermath of war in a systematic way. On the other hand, we have 23 individuals claiming that following that policy will result in their persecution or death.
The law requires me to balance these competing interests, to weigh the needs of the many against the rights of the few." He paused, and in that silence, Margaret could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the weight of 23 lives hanging in the balance.